This is our last little segment on this, in terms of our sort of toolkit, first starter pretend toolkit on biodiversity net gain in development management. And we're going to actually work through an example.
We are, and I suppose to manage expectations, we're going to work through a single example and then explain why we're not going to work through all the examples in all the contexts, because actually it, as we've said in that other kind of video, how there is one way of thinking about BNG. I'm just going to pause a moment because I've realised the other ones I've done with this on, and for continuity reasons, I feel I should. So why don't you talk about this slide?
Okay, lovely. Yeah, so I guess the reason why we've decided to go through a worked example is that we think it's something that you would like to see, and so that you can use it to explain to others that you work with. So particularly, for example, perhaps those who are validating planning applications, and others what they need to do at the various stages of a planning application, but also applicants as well, in terms of what you're expecting them to provide and why, really. I think, because we're thinking we're probably going to want to go above and beyond what the legal requirements are, and to just really explain why you need to see what we think you need to see. So we've made up an example, but I guess it's worth remembering that there are various scenarios here, and you might get, if you're really lucky, you might get a mix of all 6 of them, I guess. But yeah, you are very likely to get at least a couple. And yeah, so just do bear that in mind. And we, as we've said in the previous videos for this is our first stab at this. We will update it as we go along and based on your feedback. And the point of these videos is really for you to take this stuff away and have a go at it with your colleagues and with your applicants in your place. You will have a way that you do this locally. In a lot of places you will have already started this and be testing it out in terms of how does BNG work. Maybe not the proper official legal version of it, but your policy version of it. And you will have, if not already, over time some local requirements, so you need to think that in. So we've just done a really basic version, really to take through those scenarios and to understand why we're saying that we think certain requirements go above and beyond the legal minimum and that sort of thing. But that's the reasoning.
And we're doing it alongside having lots of conversations with developers and with their consultants and their ecologists, and they're all saying, yes, of course we're going to do it like this, because how could we not? And if we're paying the ecologists to come up with this stuff to support planning application, well, then we're going to introduce it into the planning application stage right at the outset. So I think a lot of this is, it might sound like we're describing problems, but I think applicants don't see problems. I think they're all saying how it's all going to work with goodwill and common sense.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we've given the example as if it's a major site. I think it would be lovely in time if we had a real planning application, because I think it would also be good to kind of show the job of the metric and the job of the map layers that are required to start thinking about condition and things like that, because until you kind of see it, I think it all feels a bit mysterious. But we're just going to follow it through in principle. I think the thing that we're going to point out is this statutory minimum approach versus a common sense approach in terms of information handling reduces the risk, reduces the risk of kind of nasty last minute surprises. And we've taken what we think is going to be the most common scenario. This is possibly the case with majors, definitely going to be the case with non-majors, in my view. I think, time will tell, because we'll be able to count them. But the scenario that we're going to take is there is going to be some biodiversity value post-development, but it's not going to be anything to write home about. It might be some trees, some landscaping, some stuff around the car park. It's not going to be significant. We'll have a separate conversation about what that kind of means and why that's a special word. And it's going to be secured by condition. And the remainder, if you like, the biodiversity unit deficit is going to be bought from a local provider, a bank, whatever, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Okay, let's walk it through. So this is what the PPG says. It says, starting at pre-application, applicants are encouraged to, which I think is all it can say, really, because there's no requirement to. We think, and what Paz thinks will appear in this little yellow box at various points through this presentation, we think something that might be called a BNG, a biodiversity statement, an ecology statement, something like that, which basically is a statement of intent. We're intending to do some landscaping, we'll need to buy some units, we can't deliver it all on site because effectively how they're going to approach the biodiversity, come on, help me out, what's it called?
Biodiversity gain hierarchy.
Thank you. It's the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And then also,
we've done a lot of this.
And alongside that, perhaps how we've minimised adverse effects as per the NPPF hierarchy.
Yeah, and I guess how they're going to meet, how they're going to meet that 10%, but not in the detail, not in a load of detail, but yeah.
Exactly. Not binding, not committing, but just basically saying, yes, we have thought about it. It's not going to be a nasty surprise to us either. And we're confident, and we factored it in, and it's, effectively, you don't need to worry about us not understanding this. So that's pre-application. At application stage, this is what the PPG says. The application must be accompanied by the minimum information, and it may need to provide information about significant and use of off-site gains. And there's also a kind of separate point here, perhaps, that there is a general biodiversity condition, which will be front and center of everybody's minds, and it's going to have some model paragraphs, but we don't know what they're going to be at the moment. And I think this comes as a little bit of a shock, I think, is that you don't have to talk about the post-development situation. So in terms of like his current, his pre, his post, you don't have to provide that information as part of your supporting information for your planning application. And I think, this has caused everyone to kind of go, what, really? But so it doesn't form part of the minimum information. And I think, the reason is that the Environment Act doesn't require it, and therefore the guidance can't say you are required to, but literally everybody we talk to says, yes, of course we do. It makes total sense to. It might not be final, it might not be complete, and the bigger and the more complicated the development and the more phases it's got, the more caveats it might have. But of course, we're going to understand kind of what we're working back from. So we've called it possibly a draft biodiversity gain plan, but that's the job it does.
Yeah.
Happy?
Yeah, I think that's good for me.
Okay, and then so we get to the point of the consent. So the planning committee consent the application, and the separate general biodiversity condition is placed on the decision notice. We don't really know what that's going to be yet, and it's going to be a condition separate to the other conditions that are going to be on the notice. We'll kind of have to have a look at it to see how that kind of stacks up. And
I guess we've got the condition because it's in the Environment Act. I think the thing we don't have is the sort of model paragraphs for the informative. Yeah, so we know what the condition is, which is basically, it's that they've got to submit a biodiversity gain plan pre-commencement, and that's got to be approved by the local planning authority. So that's basically the condition. And then there's obviously all sorts of stuff that covers what that biodiversity gain plan is and things like that. So we know that, but what we don't know is exactly what the suggested wording is going on the decision notice is going to be.
Okay. And then I suppose at the point of considering the application at planning committee, they, in a yellow box, so this is not the statutory guidance, this is what Paz thinks. What Paz thinks is that they will have in front of them the draft biodiversity action plan, so they're able to consider the BNG hierarchy, they're able to consider the NPPF hierarchy anyway, and they'll be able to take a view of their judgment about whether this application should be consented or not. Then here we go into this condition, the pre-commencement condition. There is lots and lots and lots of stuff here, isn't there? So I think we're not saying that there's anything missing. I think we're saying this is fine. I think the condition is discharged in our kind of walkthrough case study. We're saying that the condition is discharged by the officer under delegated powers because the information in it is in line with the draft that's already been considered by planning committee.
Yeah.
And I guess there would be some, again, a sort of judgment there about, well, members at committee made this decision because they thought it would be in these sorts of lines. If then comes forward in quite a different kind of way, there's a judgment about, well, do we want to go back and talk to a committee and say, you thought it would be like this, it's actually like that, are you still happy? Whereas if it is in line, I think, we can't really have planning committees clogged up discharging conditions. So I think this is the way our worked example works, because I think, again, it's sort of common sense. Then post-completion, and again, this is, I think, one of those areas where we've detected some dissent and some disagreement with our take on life. But because this development has brought in units from a provider, that you don't have, in terms of this planning application, there's no obligation to go and check that it's really happening, because they'll be checked in scenario 1, which we talked about when we were talking about scenarios. There's no additional kind of monitoring or enforcement kind of liability here, and no need to charge for it. No need to charge for the kind of monitoring part of it, because in our case study, the on-site gains are secured by condition. If the tree dies, if there's something, if the whatever habitats are there don't work out, in theory, you can fix them through a breach of condition notice. And again, just to flag, not everyone agrees with this. There are definitely people out there saying, we are going to have a section 106. You are going to pay us to monitor. It just, I just don't know how that makes sense. I mean, because it could be 200 miles away. You're going to just send people on a little jolly saying, go and check that bit of habitat is still there. Anyway, that will kind of come out in the wash.
Yeah.
And then I think there's a question mark here, isn't there? So we're into the kind of longer term post-development, the monitoring of BNG and habitat success. Do you understand what happens next?
Not completely, I would say. So I think this is something where we have sort of gone a little bit around the houses. So I guess the important thing that I always say about is there's kind of 2 different kinds of monitoring. So there's habitat monitoring. So the actual delivery of that habitat, has that happened? And then there's kind of like somebody checking that. So that for that, you've obviously got to go on site and go, has it actually happened, and do some measurements, and probably have an ecologist doing that. And then there's okay, well, there's a role for the person who has the legal agreement with the person that is doing that work to then check that. And that's where the reporting comes into me, is like, you get a report that says, yes, I said I would create 0.5 of a hectare of reed bed, and here's my lovely map showing 0.5 of a hectare of reed bed, and then there's some nice semi-improved grassland next to it, etc. And here's some evidence that I've done that, and I report on that after 2 years, after 5 years, after 10 years. Oh, look, it's getting better and better. I told you that the condition would be this, and it's getting better over time, and the condition is improved using the metric. I think so for on-site, I think in our scenario, we're not going to be doing that, because we're saying it's the habitat isn't particularly important, I think. I guess the question then is onto the off-site side of things. Now, in theory, that role of checking it all is with whoever set up the agreement for the off-site. So that might be this particular LPA, but it's not related to the planning application. But I think we also get into some questions now, which I don't know that we want to get into on this, on the reporting under the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, which is a requirement to report on biodiversity. And there are some requirements on that to report on how biodiversity net gain is going in your district, in your area. And I think we get into a little bit of a question there around, well, what, if you've got offsite, but you're not managing that agreement, how are you going to report on that? And that should all be on the National Register. So is there not a role for the National Register to report on that? And I think we haven't quite got to the bottom of that, is what I would say. And I think we have got some sort of guidance on, what the LPA's role in this, but I think it's still, so I mean, there is guidance, for example, from DEFRA saying that the LPA or responsible body should monitor whether the landowner is meeting their obligations, take action if they do not, which is obviously related to enforcement. But I think we're still, that sort of, this is still a bit of a question mark in my head, I would say.
Yeah, I think we will, when we understand it, I think the best thing is to go back to those scenarios and to say,
Yeah.
here's, if you like, we've discovered the DM part of that. And then there's a bit on the right hand, which is how does the data work? How does the reporting work?
Yeah.
Because just to go back to this point where I've been saying, I don't think that people should be putting monitoring money into offsite contribution. Well, actually, if you've still got to collate everyone saying 5 years later and it's all still here, and then you've
Yeah.
got to somehow summarize it and turn it into a thing that you then have to do a thing. Well, then there is an obligation, and you probably should be paid to do it. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to afford to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is probably an action from this video, is for us to take that away. And I think, again, we'll get into what are the legal requirements for BNG under the Environment Act. But how does that relate to the NERC? I'm always trying to avoid getting into the NERC, what we call the NERC duty, the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act duty, because I'm like, oh, that's not my job, I just do BNG. But I think we kind of need to address that, because we need to understand what local authorities are going to need to report. But also, there's something about what you might want to do, because when we're talking here, we're talking about the legal requirements, but we're also talking about what you might want to do above and beyond that. So for your place to make BNG really work and to make it actually succeed and deliver stuff for 30 years, you may want to do, it may not be a legal requirement, but you may still want to have some of this in place because you want to check it's actually happening. Because if it doesn't actually happen, you may as well not bother doing it. You could spend all this time agreeing a Section 106. Doesn't actually happen, which we know does happen with landscaping plans generally, because they're not checked on. So I think there is something about, yes, there's the legal side of it, but there's also the, how do we make this a real success?
Well, and I think also there's then how much of it do you bother trying to chase down individual planning applications? And how much do you end up doing anyway, because you're then repeating the LNRS kind of process?
Yeah, exactly.
And revisiting, a year and a half later, you pick up your LNRS and go, well, the intention had been to make a successful intervention here off the back of this planning application. And so we want to find.
Yeah, and I think the offsite, I think there's still
it.
some questions as well about the register and whether you could glean quite a lot of information off the register potentially, so you don't need to ask for individual reports. It'd be nice if you could just get a bit of a summary report, but I'm not quite clear on that either. So yeah, I think I would say that we have got quite a lot of question marks on that slide. So it feels to me like, yeah, we've still got those, but we will try and find the answers. I guess that's our sort of holding is, yeah, we're trying to work this one out.
So I suppose just 2 slides to finish up this worked example then. Hopefully we've been able to explain why we don't feel yet ready to make a definitive roadmap. It might be that in time we become comfortable enough to make 2 or 3, depending on different kind of scenarios. I think the first step of this is for us to acknowledge that we don't think it makes sense to have a roadmap that only reflects the statutory minimum. Therefore, you as the LPA are going to have to say, here's how we want to do it. And then you're going to have to make a roadmap that relates to how you do it. And it might be that we end up saying, here's a starter for 10, or here's what we think is good, or even as we have up to now, here's a superstar that we think has done a great job. Why don't you use Buckinghamshire as a sort of starter for 10?
Yeah.
So I think my advice would be, yes, to definitely push for upfront early site. But I think, and again, don't want to labour the point too much, but I think there is something here about saying nature's a bit of a fickle beast. Ask for intent, ask for intentions, ask for what you think you're going to be able to do, but don't ask for the impossible and say, if you don't, give us a final and binding, like post-development value kind of metric that you're going to be signed up to, or we refuse to validate your planning application. That for me just doesn't feel like a sensible or proportionate way of approaching it. And remember also, this isn't really the apocalyptic problem that some people worry about, because developers want to know this stuff too, and they'll already know this stuff too because they've got to make their development stack up, and they and you will already have quite well engineered processes to kind of say, well, here's a you know, here's a landscaping scheme, here's how we pass liability for landscaping scheme
Yeah.
onto an operating company, and blah blah, and can we just do it the same way as we do that because we all understand it?
Yeah,
And you'll
exactly.
find a kind of a groove to do that. Right, I'm going to ignore that last point because I think that's copied from another slide. I think I just wanted to start to end with just a couple of points. So these are things that I've snaffled from our K-Hub.
Basecamp.
Basecamp, yes. And there's one that I like and one that I don't like. And I guess I don't like this one, to be honest. And I know it's a kind of work in progress, and I think it's probably moved on since the screenshot that I grabbed. But it's just kind of, it's a bit, you know, black and white, isn't it? It's like, can you confirm that you've done this? Otherwise, we're not going to validate your planning application. And the thing that they're wanting you to complete is a load of stuff. And actually, if you only want to say, look at the site, of course we can't do it on site. It'd be ridiculous to do it on site. We're just going to buy the unit/credits. They're only going to be this much. We factored it in. You just don't need to worry. Then I think there's the second version of this, which is asking for a statement with an indication of this and how you're going to approach that. I think that feels to me much more in the right territory. And, you know, I think it's going to be a bit like design and access statements, where I think people are actually quite clever and they can be proportionate. And if someone wants to build a shed, design and access statement say, well, it's a shed and therefore it looks like a shed and full stop. I mean, we've all seen that one that's sort of done the rounds about with that handwritten design and access statement. And I think we'll end up with kind of a similar variety for biodiversity statements.
Yeah, and I think we need to bear in mind with that first example, for example, if you are buying units from somebody else, they will have to put those post-development details into the metric because you won't have those details. So, but you're not gonna, a developer is not gonna buy them until they've got planning permission, because they'd be completely insane to. How can you expect them to? So actually, you know, there is something about the logic here. Although we've said it doesn't completely work, there is, in this circumstance, there is definitely a logic to why you need that pre-commencement and post-consent, because you're just not going to have bought those units, and that's why it comes in at that biodiversity game plan stage, pre-commencement, post-consent. So you know, actually, you might want to ask for the post-development details to the metric tool for on-site to be provided. That might be reasonable, but probably not for off-site. You know, so I think it's that, and I think this is where, you know, there's a lot of nuances depending again on your scenario, which is why we started with scenarios. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I think that is it for this happy little segment of our BNG learning journey, with only 2 more things to go, I think.
Excellent.